What else then is missing from those mainstream U.S. media headlines on Libya today? Well, here to tell me is Asia Times correspondent Pepe Escobar. He has been covering this from the beginning. He's in Brazil. He joins us. So, Pepe, thanks for being here. Why do you think the U.S. media is lauding this as a victory focused not on the death toll or the reports on the ground that civilian infrastructure has been targeted, but on a possible NATO victory?
Well, it was a NATO victory because without NATO, the rebels, or the NATO rebels, as they are called by many Libyans in Libya, would never get to Tripoli. Very important information. In early July, more or less, the Obama administration came to the conclusion that first-class intel in terms of satellite images and armed drone images as well would be passed to NATO commanders. They were not being passed before because they were considered, American national security items. Since then, NATO intensified the bombings. They decided finally that the major plan after 5 months where there was a stalemate or a quagmire would be, okay, let's try to get Tripoli. And that's how they launched Operation Siren on 8 p.m. Libya time on Saturday evening. And that's when they start killing everyone in sight and everything, and hitting everything in sight during Saturday night and throughout Sunday. And this includes, in Mahdi's report that you just played, attacks on independent journalists, like those CNN and BBC correspondents who pathetically are inside the hotel wearing a bulletproof vest. They are not being attacked, but independent media are being attacked.
So, Pepe, my question to you then is, if NATO's goal, its stated goal from the beginning was to protect civilians, protect civilian casualties, and yet you have these reports of civilians being targeted, civilians being killed, then why do you think the U.S. media doesn't focus on these at all today?
Because, this is the cover story. The story from the beginning was R2P, responsibility to protect. That was the basis for UN Resolution 1973. That was the basis of the agreement between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. We get a resolution based on your fake Arab League vote, 9 countries out of 22. And you can do anything you want with Bahrain or in Saudi Arabia itself. But this was the cover story sold to American and European public opinion, especially. The Chinese, the Russians, many people in Brazil, for that matter, they're not buying it. They know it's a U.S. NATO coordinated operation. Without them, there will be no victory. This would be a stalemate that will go forever. And we have the international community, sort of, basically the Atlanticist powers, taking sides in a civil war. So when they knew that they could go on for months or maybe years on that, they said, okay, let's try to take Tripoli in one day. And they did it because they bombed the whole city and the way towards the city.
And you know what? You just brought up a point that I was going to bring up with you. You said this is a cover story, so the question becomes a cover story for what you say a civil war. I want to show images today that we're seeing all over the mainstream media are of rebels cheering in Green Square in Tripoli, rebel supporters waving their flag. Now take a look back just a week. If we could roll that footage. There you have, look, the same scene but with Gaddafi supporters cheering victories with their flag in Green Square in this same place just a week ago. So, Pepe, was this a civil war that NATO got involved in from the get-go?
Yes, absolutely. And these images that are being broadcast everywhere from, I wish I was in Green Square yesterday, really. It reminds me of my good old times of reporting on the ground. And you see Western mountain Berbers. You see mercenaries that came from Benghazi. You see mercenaries were recruited in the east part of Libya by Qatari special forces and Emirates special forces. And they were sent by ship on Saturday to the shores of Tripoli, protected by NATO ships. And, of course, you also see people from the outskirts of Tripoli who were against Gaddafi. Remember these people when they demonstrated 3 or 4 months ago. They were savagely repressed. So it's a mix. You have a rent-a-mob crowd, and you have legitimate Democrats or aspiring Democrats as well. But this is being sold as the whole population of Tripoli now surging towards the rebels. It's not true. It's not true.
So then, Pepe, the question becomes, what is next for Libya's leadership? I mean, who is going to rule, and is it going to be who's going to rule? You mentioned that this is a mixed group. This is not a unified rebel force.
Exactly. The Transitional Council, you remember that 2 weeks ago, they killed their own military commander, and they antagonized one of the key eastern Libyan tribes, the Obeidi, which are not behind the Transitional Council anymore, as far as we can tell. We have Gaddafi loyalists that defected 2, 3, 5 months ago. We have Islamists, Al-Qaeda-linked Salafi jihadi hardcore Islamists, which were operating in coordination with the boots on the ground, British Special Forces, Qatari Special Forces, and French Special Forces as well. We have, I would say, a minority of secular Syrian icons, let's put it this way, who really want democracy. And we have all the Western interests that are already, look, I just saw a story 5 minutes ago on the net. The scramble, the power play for Libya's oil has already started. So who's the Transitional Council is going to reward? Obviously, basically, NATO countries, especially France and England.
Okay, so you just touched on several points I want to get to. First, what are we going to see the U.S. and NATO do now? Because look, already today, I want to show you a quote from the Council on Foreign Relations president had an op-ed in the Financial Times called "Libya Now Needs Boots on the Ground." And just to quote from that, if we have it, he essentially says some sort of international assistance and most likely an international force is likely to be needed for some time to restore and maintain order. Is that what we're going to see now?
Well, this is completely crazy because people have such a short memory. You know what this reminds me of? I was there at the time. The Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq in 2003. This is the same thing. We're going to have Western boots on the ground, and we're going to open up Libya for hardcore, no-holds-barred turbo capitalism, with repatriation of profits, let's get their oil as soon as we can, the best contracts possible, and all that. This is completely crazy. If this is the way, we don't know yet, that the U.S. and NATO goes, we're going to have Iraq 2.0 soon.
How does this bode for the U.S., given though, unlike Iraq 2.0, the U.S. is now in $14.6 trillion of debt, so you have a whole other element to that story. How does this bode for the U.S. if it is Iraq 2.0?
Exactly. Who's going to pay for that? China again? Look, like international community supporting R2P in Libya. It's a miss. The BRIC countries, who are, in fact, the only ones that are really developing in the middle of this recession between the U.S. and Europe. The BRIC countries are totally against it. They voted, they abstained, which means voting against UN Resolution 1973. And they know that these contracts, especially the Russians, the Chinese, and the Indians, they know that the contracts in oil and gas are going to especially France and Britain. And even Italy. Eni had very good contracts with Gaddafi. They're going to lose everything that they had because Italy was not part of this close NATO coalition.
And it's funny because we've already learned that the Italian foreign minister has already sent oil workers from Italy back in. There will definitely be a play for that 1.6 million barrels of oil a day that the world used to rely on from Libya. But my question to you, you have been covering this for Asia Times. You mentioned the BRICS. You mentioned a different perspective. What has been the biggest takeaway for your reporting of what's going on today in Libya for your audience?
Look, what I learned from the beginning was that R2P, humanitarian interventionism, is the way the American ruling elites rebranded George Bush's Greater Middle East. So I am sure the next step is going to be Syria, even if the BRICS are against it. And sooner or later it's going to be Lebanon as well, because the master plan is to isolate all these pockets that do not fall in the hands of turbo liberalism in the world. And this means what? Northern Africa.
There you go. Pepe, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm sorry to cut you off there, but that is the headline that you just gave us that I can guarantee you our viewers are not going to see on the U.S. mainstream media. That was Asia Times correspondent Pepe Escobar.